Dr. Ghosh has been actively involved in the design of the International Solar Alliance since its inception. He conceptualized and is the founding board member of the Clean Energy Access Network. He previously worked at Princeton, Oxford, UNDP, and WTO in Geneva. He's written or edited 4 books, and his essay, Rethink India's Energy Strategy in Nature, was selected as one of 2015's 10 most influential essays. Dr. Ghosh advises governments, industry, civil society, and international organizations around the world. And this includes the Prime Minister's office in India, several ministries, state governments. He was invited by France to advise on the COP21 climate negotiations and also advised extensively on global hydrofluorocarbon negotiations. He serves on the executive committee of the India-US Pace Setter Fund. He is a member of Track 2 dialogues with 9 countries and regions and formulated the Maharashtra Guangdong Partnership on Sustainability. He writes a monthly column in the Business Standard, hosted a documentary on water in Africa, featured in a National Geographic documentary on energy, and he is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader, member of their Global Future Council on Energy, and an Asia Society Asia 21 Young Leader. He holds a DPhil from Oxford and top economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. I now invite you to take over, and we look forward to this session.
Deepest appreciation to Mahindra Group for inviting me here to join you in this conversation. When Anirban asked me, he approached, we've known each other for many years, but in November, there was an IFC conclave on sustainability finance. At that time, Anirban suggested that I come down and to Mumbai and talk to the Sustainability Council of the group. And the topic that he posed for me was climate change risks, management and mitigation. And what I'll do through the course of my presentation is try to first get you to think about why we should be thinking about risks in the first place, rather than climate change as a sort of an average incident. Why should we think of it in risk terms? And then I will try to talk to you about how those risks are going to manifest in sort of direct and indirect terms. And then I'll talk a little bit about what is happening in India in terms of trying to mitigate or adapt to these changes. Some of it is happening through national policy. Some of it might be happening through individual sort of corporate initiatives. And then I'm going to close with some thoughts on what kind of new platforms are necessary to deal with the challenge that we face. I'm going to take about 25, 30 minutes during the course of this presentation, but please feel free to interrupt me should something not be very clear. So let me just start by introducing the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We were set up in August of 2010. And so we are just about 7.5 years old. In these last 7.5 years, as was just mentioned, in the last 5 years running, we've been ranked South Asia's #1 think tank and amongst the world's leading think tanks in both the climate change domain, but across several other areas. Our work currently is divided into areas that focus on energy access, renewables, and the broader power sector. But also then we look at broader issues related to industrial sustainability, towards modeling our low carbon pathways. Just this morning, there was some news report that Minister Prabhu, who in fact was our founding chairperson, is announcing there's a new industrial policy about to come out. In fact, about 4 years ago, under the previous Prime Minister's office, and then subsequently even when this government came into power, we had done work on what would be new strategic industries for India, and where there's both value addition as well as sustainability. And then we also deal with risks and adaptation, both global climate change risks, but also local environmental challenges. And then we try to facilitate partnerships within and across, within India and across countries on technology, finance, and trade. There's one more thing that we do, which is train a lot of youngsters, one of whom is sitting in the room. Aditya Ramji, who's recently joined the group. He was with us until last year. And I don't know how many of you have already interacted with Aditya. But we have a young team. Our median age is 29.7. And we believe that that reflects India's demography. And we should be using the brightest minds in the country and outside to develop the solutions for the challenges that we face. So why do we do a risk assessment? Let me start with this graph. And those on the call, I know you don't have access to the presentation, but hopefully what I talk would be self-evident. Now, the graph that is in front of you shows two things, and some of you might have already seen it. One is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back to about 800,000 years. And the other is concentration, the temperature measurements in the Antarctic going back about 800,000 years. Now, how do we actually do this? The way this is done is you go to really cold places and you drill really deep down, and you take stacks of frozen ice, and then you measure the concentration of gases in each molecule. And depending on the layer of the ice, you're able to get a sense of what was happening. Now, in each of these, you can see that there has been a natural up and down in the concentration of carbon dioxide in global atmosphere. Okay. And then you have to obviously understand these are thousands of years, and that's why the smallest of blips is maybe a period of 5,000 years or so. But you will see a rise in temperatures with a small lag after the CO2 concentrations go up, right? Except now when we come to present day, you see the concentration of carbon dioxide is higher in the atmosphere than at any point in the last 800,000 years. The temperatures are not as high yet simply because of that lag, right? And you see the same in terms of whether you're measuring in the Antarctic or closer to the Arctic. This is a slightly smaller time horizon where we go back about 100,000 years. So humans migrating out of Africa, settled civilization beginning in terms of agriculture, etc. And again, you can see the concentration of greenhouse gases being higher than at any point in sort of settled human history. So human beings as a settled civilization have never encountered temperatures or greenhouse gas concentrations as have occurred through geological time in their own existence on the planet. So we actually don't know how to deal with this.
How do you get the temperature readings for 800,000 years and so on and so forth?
The same is done for the kind of when you drilling through the ice cores, you're also trapping into the molecules are demonstrating both the concentration of the greenhouse gases, but they're also revealing, based on the kind of fossils, etc., that you're finding, the vegetation, that reveals the kind of temperatures that were prevailing. So I'm not a physical scientist, but that's the kind of methods that scientists use to do this.
Quick question on the graph. That point of 300 on the CO2.
Yes.
That would correspond to roughly which year? Would we know that?
300 was maybe a couple of decades ago. So we had 250 parts per million pre-industrial age, so from the mid-18th century, about 1750. Now, those concentrations of gases have gone up. About 3-4 years ago, we crossed 400. Right? And what, again, climate scientists argue is that to have a reasonable chance could be 66%, to keep temperature rise within 2 degrees above pre-industrial, the concentration should not cross 450 parts per million. Now, of course, this is also changing, and I'll come to that in a second because well, let me actually complete that point. Because our climate models are actually based on measuring primarily surface temperatures on land. The bulk of the heat that falls on the Earth's surface is actually absorbed by the oceans. Our understanding of ocean dynamics is much poorer than our understanding of surface temperature dynamics. What that does is it creates a positive feedback loop, which means that just like if you boil a pot of water, water expands. Now, as that water expands, the surface that is absorbing the heat actually is absorbing. So it's creating a positive feedback that the heat that gets absorbed expands the water body, and then that is absorbing even more heat. So how the ocean dynamics and the land dynamics might influence the temperature increase, it's possible that actually you would cross the 2-degree bar well before your 450 parts per million. Yeah.
I just had a question on
Yes.
the earlier slide.
Yes.
Does it mean that it was the beginning of agriculture that has created this problem?
It's an interesting question, actually, because I was discussing with Anirban a little while ago about negative emissions technology. So there's something called geoengineering. Like, can we come up with technologies that can engineer the global climate at scale? And there are ethicists who argue that this is a human hubris beyond any control. But actually, if you think about it, settled agriculture is a form of geoengineering. We began, since the time human beings as a species settled down and started doing settled farming, we've been transforming the face of the planet. Now, what actually now scientists have started arguing is that we have, as a species and in geological terms, entered a new era called the Anthropocene, where it's not just the natural processes of rocks, shifting against each other, but human impact on the planet is impacting the planet as a whole, not just in. So hence Anthropocene, the geological age is changing because of human activity. And settled agriculture is sort of the start of that in a sense. But of course, industrial civilization from 1750 onwards has spiked this in a different order altogether. Now, I was coming to why do a risk assessment rather than why not just look at a 2 degrees scenario. When we say temperatures are going to rise by 2 degrees, the layperson may say, well, in an average day, it's happening much more, so I'm perfectly fine with it. But this is average across the global surface. The spikes are significantly different, and the purpose of doing risk assessments is to not just hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And if you look across industry or national security, risk assessments are a natural course of things. If you talk to actuaries, right, for them, if you remember, in the early 90s, there was Black Monday when the pound crashed. Now that crash, no one expected the pound to crash, but that crash almost brought down the global insurance industry. Right? So new regulations were put in place that you had to insure against a once in a 200-year financial crisis event rather than once in a 20, 30-year kind of event to deal with that. Okay. Same thing what reinsurance companies do, that they avoid dangers of averaging. They look at the tail end of the curves because that's what they've got to protect against. When you look at science advisors, say a public health crisis, we don't think about just on average how many people might fall sick or not. When you're a public health advisor or a science advisor reporting to the Prime Minister or the President, you have to think about a global pandemic crisis that can pan out within a span of a few months, say avian influenza. So again, you need to think about the interactions of direct and indirect systems. National security. General Gordon Sullivan was a general of the US Army, and this quote from him actually sums it up. If you wait until you have 100% certainty, something bad is definitely going to happen on the battlefield. So you've got to act under uncertainty, but you've got to plan for the worst. When the 9/11 Commission report was written up, the big fat document, the main message that the 9/11 Commission delivered was it wasn't a failure of national security, of our security forces, etc. It was a failure of imagination. We could not envision how our security could be undermined. So if you're a company or a country, risk is a function of the impact you're considering. So you have a factory. Is it going to get flooded by a coastal flooding event? Right? That's the impact you want to protect against. You, of course, want to look at the probability of that happening. Maybe there's a 1% chance of that happening, and therefore, when you're building that factory, you put in sufficient measures for that 1% probability. But especially in the context of climate change, it is a function of time as well. The reason is many risks that we consider in the normal course of things are linear risks. They're flat risks. You can predict them in terms of time intervals. Say an earthquake. I can't tell you when an earthquake is going to happen, but I can tell you that an earthquake of 7 points on the Richter scale happens in once every 30 years. One of 10 points on the Richter scale will happen once every 80 years or something like that. So you can't predict when, but you can predict the averages and the intervals. But
therefore multiplying it by 1 effectively.
In terms of time.
Because then your risk will be equal to impact.
Exactly. But when you're dealing with climate change, this factor changes everything. Because the risks, the impacts, and the probability changes over time. So you can't have a linear trajectory. Which is the difference between climate change and most other risks that we deal with. Global surface temperature rise. These are the climate models that the IPCC had published. Their new report will come out later this year. So you can see that we've got data until about here, and then the range is significant, right? You could be going from anywhere between, about 1.5 degrees of temperature rise to 12 degrees of temperature rise, of course, over the course of the next 2-3 centuries. But even if you looked at 2100, you have a range that is going from 1.5 to 6 degrees, depending on what are called concentration pathways of emissions. Right? So your risks will change depending on how much stock of carbon is going to get locked into the atmosphere. I think, where is this? I think I should be pointing it wherever it's there. Yeah. Sorry? It's this laptop. Okay. No. Yeah. Non-linear risk. Yeah, could you just tap it, please? Thank you. Now, I've intentionally put up this cartoon. Now, suppose you were a science advisor, but you were also looking at this frog that is sitting in a pot of water. Okay? The frog might say, okay, I'm feeling a little warm. What's going to happen? Okay. So as a science advisor, you're not supposed to give certainties because you don't have certainties. You give ranges. You say, well, there's a probability of 85% that your body temperature will increase by about 2 degrees or so. over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. Okay, fine. After a while, if the frog asks you, I'm feeling really hot, what's going to happen? So you can give a probability estimate of temperatures rising, so 4 degrees, etc. If the question were changed, and the frog asks, I'm feeling really uncomfortable, what is the worst that could happen? Then your answer as a science advisor changes. Because while you have to stick within your ranges of your probability, when you look at the tail end of the curve, when you're trying to answer what's the worst that could happen, you answer that, well, the worst is you're going to boil to death, right? And it's going to happen beyond 15 minutes, etc. The question then that the frog has to answer is, should I prepare for that 15-minute scenario or should I prepare for a 5-minute scenario? And that's the difficulty, right? As policymakers or as industry investors, we of course can't afford to be frogs in the well, but how do we make a decision, or what is the time horizon over which we are trying to protect ourselves and our investments? Could you go to the next slide, please? So what are we doing to the climate? Next slide, please. Yeah. Let's just go back one slide. So I was talking about the representative concentration pathways. Now these are over the course of this century, the biggest pathway, the highest concentration pathway takes you to average greenhouse gas emissions per year of over 120 billion tons annually. To actually stick to some sort of a 2-degree probability, we need to be bringing down that curve somewhere here where we are not putting out more than 10 to 15 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per annum, right? So this is the range within which we have to operate. Right now, we are somewhere along this trajectory. And Anirban and I were discussing, how soon do we peak? Depending on when you peak, if you peak, say, 2030, then you have to bring down your curve like that. But if you peaked in, say, 2050, then you have to bring down your curve like that. So the slope of decrease rapidly increases depending on when you're deciding to peak. So that's the way humans are putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Now, what will a changing climate do to us? And this is where the risk assessment comes in. Number one, heat stress. And this goes back to why I was talking about nonlinear risks. Suppose you had global average temperatures rising by 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. You see that the probability of fatal heat exposure remains fairly low. Except once you hit 4 degrees, it shoots up. And these are models that have been done for North India, Southeast China, Guangdong, Shenzhen area, and Southeast United States, Atlanta, Georgia, etc. So major, not just major economies, but major industrial and economic hubs of major economies. Okay? The probability of experiencing fatal heat exposure increases sort of in a non-linear way as soon as you reach global surface average temperatures of 4 degrees above pre-industrial. Which is why you can't plan for a flat horizon in terms of your risk profiles. So if you were setting up a new factory in southeastern China or in Punjab, right, you have to look at whether your workforce is going to be productive at all, or will be able to, some models estimate that beyond this 4-degree pathway, the possibility of working outdoors becomes nil. Now, of course, you can put air conditioning in your factories, etc., but then you have to factor in all the investment costs. And that's just one factory for one company. But you have to put in that system for the entire economy, whether it's your transport, housing, buildings, none of which might be within the control of a single company. That's heat stress. And my other colleague has done calculations for Indian cities in particular. more than 80% of fatalities from heat stress happen in 5 cities: Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, and Kolkata over the course of the first half of this century. Right? So as we urbanize, we are now the fastest urbanizing country. If we took only our urban population, we would be the third largest country by population. Now, are we putting in systems to deal with this kind of significant risk? And we could be hitting this over the course of the next half century.
I was surprised to hear Mumbai is in that list.
And not Chennai.
These are based on,
And not Vijayawada.
yeah. We've recently completed another risk assessment for Amravati, where we are looking at how the heat stress, this is just heat stress for humans, but the heat stress could impact road integrity, water supply, and the efficiency of power plants. 3 most important things to make a city run. We've done it for Bhopal, Indore, Gwalior, and the new capital city of Amravati. So, of course, I mean, we can say, why not Chennai, etc. These are results from the models. You can change the parameters of the models, etc. But the point is to demonstrate that road integrity. So, road integrity, power plant efficiency, and water supply.
And presumably agriculture will be over there.
My next slide is on agriculture. Just like humans, plants, which are also organic matter, have heat stress limits. You can't actually grow as a plant if you are exposed to a severe heat stress. Okay? And that's why we are talking about the tail end of the risks, not average temperature rise. So, and that impacts leaf initiation, shoot growth, as well as root growth throughout the cropping cycle. And remember, we are now also looking at much, much more intensive agriculture. So not just one crop. In a single year, you're trying to grow multiple crops. Therefore, your growing period is coming down. And therefore, if within that limited growing period you have spikes of heat, you've lost that crop. And you don't have time to replant and do something else. So, So this again, modeling was done for rice in China and wheat in Punjab. And again, you can see that until about 3.5 degrees, your possibility of the lethal limits crossing for plant growth remains fairly low. At 3.5 degrees, it suddenly spikes up. Right? So again, the point is not to say that as long as you keep surface temperatures at 2 degrees overall for the world, it's fine. It's when these types of regions face those severe heat shocks, you're exposed to a massive collapse of agricultural yield. Could you go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Yeah, keep clicking. That's stop. Thank you. Water, right? Currently, global water-stressed population is about 2 billion. So that's about a third of the global population. That on the high emissions pathway increases to 5 billion within the next 50 years. Okay. Now, again, you can say, okay, 5 billion in 50 years, your global population will be somewhere around 9.5, 10 billion. Okay, maybe we can manage it. But now come to our part of the world. South Asia already has a water-stressed population that is almost as large as India's population. I don't have to explain to you that water is a point of crisis for all our neighbors. In fact, South Asia is the heart of what is called the third pole. Outside of the North and the South Pole, the maximum concentration of frozen water is in the Himalaya Hindu Kush region. Now, there are 55,000 glaciers, 10 major river systems, 8 countries, 2.5 billion people sharing all those water resources. Half of that population is already water stressed. Now, when that rises to 2 billion people over the course of the next 30 years, I don't have to explain to you the political ramifications of what that's going to mean. Same you see in Middle East. You go from 100 million people to about 400 million people water stressed. East Asia is the only place where... Sorry.
I'm struggling to understand there was a certain standard deviation that the world saw to date.
Yes.
And from your graph, it was fairly for it to slope this steep.
Could you use them? I think they won't be able to hear your question otherwise, those on the call. It's on. Yeah, it's on.
Risk, I never put the mic down.
It's on.
See, there is a certain standard deviation that your graph showed to date. And now you're showing a spike up, the steep slope, that you could move from half the population, which is about 1.25 billion, to 2 billion in a matter of 30 years. It just, I mean, I'm not saying that if I use your formula of likelihood into time, certainly everything gets multiplied by 1, therefore it can happen. But how much of a stretch is that in the realm of possibility? Why would a standard deviation widen so much in 30 years, which it hasn't over, say, 300 years? I'm not even going back thousands.
Because of the constant. So this is why these are mapped against concentration pathways of greenhouse gases. The stock of emissions that has gone into the atmosphere, as I said, there is a lag in how that impacts the various elements of the natural cycle. It could be the water cycle, it could be the carbon cycle, it could be impact on soil carbon retention, it could be the impact on what is called ocean upwelling. So each of these elements has a different tipping point. Now that tipping point begins to get crossed. That's why I was saying that till 2.5, 3 degrees, you're sort of in a manageable range, which is why again, this 2-degree target is somewhat of a political target. There's no particular scientific basis to say, if we stayed within 2 degrees, that's fine, and if we went to 2.1 degrees, it's disaster. It could be disaster at 1.5 degrees for a small island nation or for the Andamans. Okay? It might be manageable for a 3 degrees in Mumbai. Right? It might be disaster at 2.5 degrees for Uttarakhand. So of course, what constitutes a tipping point will vary from region to region. Right? But the reason that there is the spike is because the feedback loops change. So if you're taking only precipitation, the expectation is that say 80% of India's rain falls within a 3-month period, not over the 12-month period. Now that period itself shrinks, whereas the intensity of that rainfall increases. So what happens is that if we are unable to manage that water resource, you are having two types. One is a natural event, the other is a systemic indirect event. The natural event is that you're losing your rainfall precipitation period is shrinking, and the amount of water overall that's coming down is reducing, as well as the intensity of the rainfall is increasing. The indirect event is, okay, is that water that's still falling on the surface sufficient for us, or are we going to mismanage it because we've got to spread that water out over the course of 12 months and across 8 countries in the region.
So the point is that when you're simulating this,
yes,
these are future simulations with future. So it could be that you assume linear, the same kind of consumption, for example, the solar and other things.
No, in fact, that even the consumption patterns change with income growth. Your demand patterns change, whether it's for water, whether it's for energy, but also very importantly, and I'm going to come to that in the next slide, is the impact of risks. And I'll just explain that could you go to the...
One question if I could ask.
Yes.
East Asia seems to be getting better, and in fact, even South Asia, after 50 years or
Yes.
something, starts
Yeah.
getting better.
That's because of that demography has a big role to play in this as well. Because look, on the y-axis, we are counting population. So at some stage, population is stable. In East Asia, it is actually stabilizing and on its way down. So there's a natural cycle, but then how humans are interacting with the natural cycle will be a function of income, changing demand patterns, etc., but also demography. So South Asia population is likely to stabilize only in the 2040s, 2050s. India will probably stabilize around 2040. South Asia as a whole will probably stabilize in 2050. So it has that function going in there as well. But I'm just going to come back to that income point in a second. Next slide, please. So I talked about water stress. Now, for the same reasons, water as a surplus as a problem as well. The exposure of flooded population for the world as a whole, but South Asia, East Asia, again increases because the river basins over which the flooding intensity is increasing you have a larger number of river basins that are affected by this, but also, again, depending on demography, how much of your population is in the coastal regions, as well as how much of your population is in the settled around the river banks, where you're going to have an increase in flooding intensity. Over the course of the last few weeks, you saw Paris going through a once-in-a-100-year precipitation event. Right? Now, can you attribute that to climate change? Perhaps not, although the science is becoming better and better to attribute individual weather events, but we are not there yet. But the question is about probabilities. Now, how do you deal with a settled population in an inland city versus a settled population in a coastal city like Mumbai in terms of the intensity of flooding events? And the reason this matters is with changing incomes, the economic cost of this increases. Now, if I were a very poor fisherman in Tamil Nadu, I have a shack somewhere near the coast and I have a boat. Now, it might be terrible from a human loss perspective if there is a coastal flooding event and my shack gets washed away and my boat gets washed away and I lose my life. But in economic terms, sorry to sound like the dismal economist, the economic value to the economy is lower because it's the cost of the shack and the cost of a rudimentary boat. Now, instead of a shack, if I had a skyscraper on the coast, instead of a boat, if I had a yacht, right? The economic cost, the insurance cost spikes up for the same economy, same region, right? So let me show that with this. Do you know where this picture is from? Any guesses? Chennai flooding. 2015 November. 3 weeks before the Paris climate negotiations began. A once in a 100-year event. Once in a 100-year flooding event. Right? The reason I've chosen this slide, this picture, is not because poor people did not lose their houses and their lives. It's because rich people also got affected. Someone is a private plane, and you can imagine the insurance costs on this. So the rich person might get the insurance benefit or might not, because did that insurance cover for a once in a 100-year event? Remember that first slide I showed you about insurance against financial crises? Now, would this be an act of God and the insurance companies are sorry? This year, this is 2015, this last hurricane season in the United States, the 3 big hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico still has not got its power back. Everyone's on gensets. Okay? The United States, the Gulf Coast and Puerto Rico, more than $260 billion of losses. Do we have insurance companies with a balance sheet to deal with that kind of loss, right, when these claims come in? Okay? Or do we need a different level of actuarial science? Why? Because the risks are unpredictable and nonlinear. Right? So what some colleagues had, not colleagues, professors in Europe had done, which fed into this book that I edited along with some others, is looked at the possibility of a once in a 100-year flooding event based on changing sea level rise, which is itself triggered by warming climate. And the risk increases 40-fold for a city like Shanghai, 200-fold for a city like New York, but 1,000-fold for a city like Kolkata. Now, we published this book, released this book in the Mumbai Stock Exchange and in the London Stock Exchange in July 2015. Why? To draw attention of the financial industry towards this kind of changing risk. 3.5 months later, Chennai was faced with a once in a 100-year flooding event. But the point this is showing is that it's not a one-off. The intensity of those kinds of events and the probability of them happening again and again goes from once in a 100 years to several times in a single year. So I can deal with Chennai floods once in a year, once in 100 years, but can I deal with that kind of flooding event happening again and again and again? Are our city systems resilient enough to deal with that?
Where does Mumbai figure in this?
Mumbai and Chennai were not modeled. These were, again, representative cities that were taken in major economies to do that modeling. But we can look at that. My colleague who has been working on Amravati, I think they've been trying to get numbers that can help to predict, but I don't think they're there yet. So we did look at, as I said, heat stress on road integrity, water, and power plants, but this is another area. So a lot of this modeling requires the kind of data that feeds into the models. So I'm giving this as an illustrative example of when these three cities were modeled. Of course, it will be different. If you, instead of New York, you replaced it with, New Orleans, this curve would probably be somewhere there. So just to summarize this point, I know we are already about at the 25-minute mark. In India alone, we've lost about $17 billion due to direct damage to floods, cyclones, temperature extremes of the last 5 years. 6-fold increase in frequency in flooding of the Ganga basin on a high emissions pathway is possible. We talked to you about a once in a 100-year flooding event for a city like Kolkata. One of you mentioned agriculture. Right? So initial modeling that my colleagues have done suggests that by 2050, crop losses in 2010 prices will be over $200 billion for India. By 2100, that will be about $350 billion in 2010 prices. Right? Cost of climate proofing current infrastructure itself, $150 billion. Right? Now, you can again take this as risk or opportunity. Well, if we have to climate proof, does that open up a new business line altogether? But that's a different conversation. Let me spend a few minutes more on the indirect risks. So far, I've been talking to you about direct risks. Any idea where this picture is from? So I've told you about what we are doing to the climate and what the climate might do to us. No. But good try. Colombia, no. Okay, I'll tell you. Huh? Paris, no. No. At least geographically, you're moving. No, but close. Very close. It's somewhere in northern Africa.
Egypt.
Tunisia. You've heard of the Arab Spring? Yeah. How did the so-called Arab Spring begin? Took one vegetable vendor who flipped out. Now, what happened is, in 2008, there were two global crises, one of which should be obvious to all of us. What happened in 2008? The housing crash and financial crash. Right? There was another major crisis in 2008. No? Yes. What happened to food? Why did prices go up? Scarcity. So there was a.
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
I think it's an echo.
So What happened was there was a sudden decrease in food production in the main sort of granaries of the world. What that led to was countries like China and India, which are self-sufficient in food, but also import and export a lot of food, decided to impose short-term export barriers. Now, the Middle East, West Asia, is net food importer. Okay. And there was a sudden spike in food prices. And that resulted in much larger social unrest. Okay? One of the triggers of the Arab Spring. Of course, there are many other reasons. In 2015, at the UN General Assembly, Prime Minister Modi said this: the world is facing two problems, that of climate change and the other is terrorism. Last month in Davos, he added a third problem, which wasn't a problem in 2015. What is the third problem? Huh? No, deglobalization, right? Trade barriers coming up, right? But the point is that the interaction of what is a human and natural cycle interaction is also going to impact what humans do to each other, how human societies deal with these crises. I'm going to take maybe 5 minutes to rush through a few more slides just to highlight some of the opportunities that might be there if we are dealing with these risks. And I put them in the context of what we call energy transitions in a constrained world. India over the next 30 years is going to become a 100-year-old independent nation. In these 30 years, it's going to go through 4 energy transitions. First, shift from traditional to modern energy, whether it's electricity access or cooking fuel access. Second, a shift from rural to urban patterns of energy demand. Bulk of the population lives in rural areas. As they shift, the pattern of energy demand will change. Transportation systems, building energy efficiency, commercial energy services. Third, deeper integration of India into global energy markets. What does that mean? That at the margin, India's energy demand will matter most for how prices shift in global energy markets. India is on the same trajectory as other developed countries and richer emerging economies like Brazil, China, etc., in terms of primary energy consumption for its level of income. Question is, when it becomes a $20,000, $30,000 per capita economy, will it be energy profligate like North America, or will it be relatively more energy efficient like Southern Europe or Japan? And it'll have to grow its economy, grow its manufacturing sector, grow jobs, etc., but shift from growth to sustainable growth. But it's going to happen in a changing political economy of energy, which is why the deglobalization point becomes important. There are a lot of trade disputes happening around clean energy. How are you going to grow that sector if we start fighting trade wars with each other? Now, let me highlight one example. We talk about energy access. And we talk about energy access of bulbs and cooking fuel. Let me illustrate it with energy access for the productive use. Farm power in India is 1/3 that of China. So as we increase mechanization, power demand will increase. So my colleagues had worked on solar irrigation and mapped out and analyzed every single district in India in terms of its return on investment based on many different criteria, whether it is cropping pattern, groundwater level, etc. Now, is this a climate risk management tool? Is it an adaptation tool, or is it a mitigation tool? It's actually both. Cooling. India's cooling demand will grow much faster than China because we are a hotter country over the next 20 years. The refrigerants used in our air conditioners are highly have high global warming potential. Now, to shift that down, we have signed this agreement called the Kigali Amendment in the Montreal Protocol to take our emissions of hydrofluorocarbons down from where it would have ended up to near zero. But this is going to cost us 16 billion euros just in direct measures Indirect measures will cost a lot more. Industrial emissions, you should know this very well. We've actually been, because we are a growing economy, have been increasing our industrial emissions. But energy efficiency has also been increasing because energy is very expensive in India. Question is, will energy efficiency suffice to bring emissions curves down? And are there business opportunities there? Right? Fourth, power plants. The incremental demand of water in India is going to be from the power sector. Even though agriculture takes up 80% of water, 95% of additional water demand will come from the power sector. So we've been working with Niti Aayog to see, can we reduce not just emissions, but also water consumption in power plants, where withdrawals and consumption can be brought down through cooling technology, dry cooling technologies. But of course, it's going to cost money. Can we use wastewater from urban areas to feed into power plants? Already some examples exist from across the world. But the point is, if you use a circular economy of water, then your return of investment changes. If you were only recovering water from that wastewater treatment, and you had a 15-year or a 5-year payback period, then your water tariff would have to be about 50 rupees. But if you were to recover water and energy, or you were to recover water, energy, and fertilizer, then your water tariffs could come down. And of course, depending on your payback periods, if you have a financing for a longer payback period, you can bring down the cost of water by half. So you've got to create a circular economy of water, energy, and food. Could you click on the next one, please? Renewables. You're invested in this space as well. We've got major targets for solar and for wind. Now, the good thing is, based on reverse auctions, we've brought down our prices from nearly 11 rupees in 2010 to under 2 rupees 50 last year. But here's the story. Our tariffs are still double that of Dubai's. And that's not because the cost of panels are more expensive significantly. It's because the cost of finance, return on equity or debt servicing, is about half to a third of the cost of finance in India. When we, from Telangana in 2016, when we looked at the Bhadla bid, could you go to the next one? It's because the cost of finance was reduced that we were able to bring down prices down to under 250. Yes?
There's a tweet by the handle of World Economic Forum today,
Yes, yes.
which says that renewables will be cheaper than fossil fuels by 2020.
Yeah, in some cases, it depends.
It's like 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, in some cases, it already is. Depending on fossil, are you comparing renewables with fossil fuel in the power sector or in, say, industrial emissions, industrial purposes? For industrial purposes, still too expensive. But power sector, yes.
Already it is.
Already it is. Your average thermal power plant price now is 3.5 rupees in India, right? Well, it's not average. That's the lowest. But yeah, we are. Now, if you add, even if you added 2-3 rupees, if we doubled that in terms of storage costs, you're still at 5.5 rupees.
The credit risk is mispriced.
Exactly. Exactly. Which is why this is the biggest. It is, for renewables growth, it's no longer the technology game, it's a finance game. Let me conclude with a bit on electric vehicles. This picture is from 2007. That's my wife and my father-in-law, who also used to work in the automotive industry. Now guess where this picture is taken? Sorry? I couldn't hear you.
London?
London, yes. It's in a small street in London, and I'm assuming you can recognize the car because you bought out the company, right? Now, at that time, there were, I believe, about 5,000 Revas in the streets of London.
No.
Or UK.
Which year?
2007.
To the best of my knowledge, 100 rivers were only sold.
No. No. In the UK. Not E2O. Not E2O. This is the original. In the larger market was outside India, Europe and UK in particular. Now, of course, at that time, there was barely any e-vehicle market in China. Now, we know where China has ended up. We are just about getting started on our major ambitions on e-vehicles, which will of course, have impact on final energy consumption as well as on carbon dioxide emissions. But here's the thing. As you very well know, about half the cost of the car is the cost of the battery. To make the battery, you need a lot of minerals. And the capacity that is being built for the batteries is in different parts of the world, but for India. Now look at the critical minerals. India's annual demand for lithium could grow to about 40,000 tons by 2030 if we meet the so-called planned targets that we've set, even though there is no formal policy behind it. Current global production of lithium, 32,000 tons. Cobalt, India would require 131,000 tons.
No, you should go down the row and highlight that across those three is China's stranglehold.
Exactly. So this is, the point is not, you're absolutely right. The point is not that global production cannot increase. We'll probably get to increasing lithium production to meet India's and the rest of the world's demand, etc. But what is already happening is that China and the United States have already identified lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, etc. as the critical mineral for this new technology. We had done work both for the national security establishment as well as under DST on a framework for critical minerals for India's industrial growth. This was in 2015-16. And then in 2017, when we added this is the critical zone, relative economic importance and supply risk. When we added our electric vehicle targets, many different minerals head off into the critical zone. So I'm going to conclude with this point that the International Solar Alliance, which was kicked off at the Paris Climate Negotiation, offers a new type of technology partnership and financing partnership, where we have to try to aggregate demand. In this case, it's solar, but you could be doing that for batteries, you could be doing that for wind, whatever. Aggregate demand, pooled risks, hedge against the credit risk, off-taker risk, currency risk to reduce the cost of finance, as well as pool resources for R&D. If we don't do that, the climate risks that I highlighted earlier, the direct, indirect, systemic risks, are not going to be met by traditional industrial policy or mercantilism. And we therefore need new types of partnerships. Those on the call cannot see this final photograph that could you just go one more step? Cannot see this final cartoon. But those of you not read, guess what's happening here in this cartoon?
People attend cocktails and
it looks like a cocktail party, a masquerading party. Well, this cartoon is from 1861, from Vanity Fair magazine. Now, what happened in 1861? Until 1860, lighting in North America would come from whale blubber, whale oil. You remember Moby Dick? Moby Dick is really about the whaling industry. You killed whale not for their meat, but for their oil. In 1861, we discovered oil in Pennsylvania. So the whales are having a ball. They are saved. In energy, there will always be winners and losers. Right? So the message I'm trying to give you is that we are dealing with a problem that we have some handle on, but have never experienced as a species. Those problems result in risks that are direct, indirect, and systemic. To respond to that, we've got to deal with our energy access problems, renewables, industrial growth, urban growth, transportation growth, but we need different models, different business models, different partnerships, and we have to deal with the political economy of change. And that perhaps is the biggest hurdle that we face, is we have far better understanding of the science and the technologies than our understanding of human interactions and politics. Let me stop there.
Did you miss the elephant in the room on this, which is this reversal of United States stance? Sri Trump.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. In some ways, it's the elephant in the room, where the commitments that it has made to scale down emissions is now sort of off the table. The commitments that have been made under the Obama administration were themselves actually quite weak. It was largely focused on the power sector. The power sector was itself about 35% of US emissions, not the rest. And within that, we were trying to reduce about a third. So a third of the problem was being dealt with, and even that is now off the table. However, as I was mentioning to Anirban offline, the problem comes not just from what we are putting into the atmosphere year on year on year, but what is actually already in the atmosphere. So if we took our sort of country hats off, the real challenge or the real business opportunity or the technology opportunity is how do we get carbon out of the atmosphere? And we are talking very little about that. So renewables will make our energy system clean. Energy efficiency will make our industrial system more efficient. Electric vehicles will make our transportation system cleaner. But none of that deals with the stock of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And it's that concentration. When you asked about why is this curve suddenly ramping up, it is because of the lag in what that concentration of carbon in the atmosphere does to your natural systems. So we are dealing with sort of a three-pronged problem. One is basic energy services for the poor, not just in India, but across the world. A minimum level of energy, because without that, you can't move your economy, you can't move up in life. A second problem of cleaning up your energy system. And a third problem, which is cleaning up the atmosphere. Now, we don't have technologies at all that scrubs the atmosphere.
NPA in the banking system.
Sorry?
Future NPAs you may control, but what to do about the
That,
NPAs?
exactly.
NPAs in banking system.
Exactly. What is already sitting there? There is no off-balance sheet outside of our atmosphere. Right? There is nothing you can recapitalize in terms of the atmosphere, to take your metaphor forward. Right? So we have to, of course, there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of risks as a corporate or as a country, also a lot of business opportunities to go forward. But it's this third big problem of what is sitting in the atmosphere, and every incremental ton that's going in is increasing to that stock, is what we are not dealing with sufficiently.
Are there some scientists or universities trying to solve
Yes, so this is what I started with right at the outset, the suite of potential technologies called climate geoengineering. They fall in two categories. One is called solar radiation management, the other is called carbon dioxide removal. Now, solar radiation management is to prevent sunlight from hitting the Earth's surface. And you can do that in all sorts of ways, each varying in degrees of craziness. Space mirrors, okay? Then come down a little lower in the atmosphere, or come down to ground level, painting your roofs white, right? So you reduce the dark surfaces. But somewhere the technology that is most talked about or researched is called injection of sulfate particles into the stratosphere. So you take sulfates, nanoparticles of sulfates, and sprinkle them into the stratosphere. When you sprinkle them into the stratosphere, get into the sort of general circulation of the stratosphere, and they have increased reflectivity, or in scientific terms, albedo, which reflects sunlight back. So you have less sunlight hitting the Earth's surface and getting absorbed. Now, this
mess up the water cycle?
it messes up water cycle, it messes up your monsoons, it messes up your crops.
Vitamin D.
It could mess up your vitamin D. And it creates It's your efficiency of solar cells, all of that. So that's preventing the heat increasing on the Earth's surface. And there's another problem, which is like stepping on a spring. Once you start this and you get off the spring, you can't stop really, because when you get off the spring, there's a sudden spike again in temperatures. The other is carbon dioxide removal. Again, all sorts of crazy thoughts. One is you can plant trees. You can plant a lot of trees, yes. But if you do what is called bioenergy and carbon dioxide sequestration, then you need a huge amount of land to be able to sequester the amount of carbon that is already there. You could be doing that through another crazy technology called ocean iron fertilization. So you start sprinkling iron in the oceans, increases the sort of fertility of the plant matter in the oceans. That then begins to absorb the carbon dioxide in the oceans. And that plant matter is then eaten by microorganisms. So the phytoplankton is eaten by the zooplankton. The zooplankton dies and sinks down to the ocean bed. Again, our modeling of what that could do to the ocean cycles is significantly poor. And then there are what are called carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. Large suction machines, which could take the carbon dioxide, filter it through various membranes, and then separate it out, and then use it for industrial purposes. None of this is proven technology, but these are sort of in the suite of what is called the global fiddling with the global thermostat. But the political risks and challenges that will emerge from this are significant.
Political and
Well, geopolitical is the better answer. Yeah. To give you one example, in 2011, CEW, we hosted the first meeting on climate engineering in India. 2 weeks later, I flew to China to brief the Chinese Academy of Science and Technology about it. At that time, China had nobody working on this. Right? India, actually, our Oceanography Institute in Goa had been already collaborating with some German institutions. But the Chinese have been cloud seeding at a lower atmosphere for rains. 5 years later, China had launched a national program on climate engineering. 2017, we had our first governmental meeting on climate engineering. Now, I'm not saying it's a panacea at all, nowhere near. But the point is, we at least have to start thinking about these things in a strategic manner.
Same thing happened with circular economy. They are way ahead of us.
Or electric vehicles. So we have to think about these things at scale. Not because scale is only what China does, because the problem we are facing with cannot be segmented into just your agricultural economy or just the renewable sector or just the industrial sector. And what we've done is a good step. We've got a mission on agriculture, a mission on energy efficiency, mission on renewables. But the next step is trying to integrate how all of that interacts.
China also addressed the cause. The cause is population growth, the demand for water, demand for resources. That they began with 50 years ago.
Well, even with correct.
There are at least 400 million less Chinese
Yeah.
because of one child norm. Imagine 400 million more Chinese.
Well, you're right, but 400 million more Chinese or 400 million more Indians into, say, India's per capita emissions, okay? 400 million into about 2 tons per capita in India, less than 2 tons or 1.9, 800 million, okay? So we go from 2 billion tons to 3 billion tons, okay? But you multiply that same 400 million extra with a US per capita emissions of 20 tons per capita, okay, you get into 8,000 million tons, so 8 gigatons of additional emissions, which is why I showed you that curve. The question is, demography is one part, but do we end up in a US kind of emissions and energy density or something else? So while we have to control for the population, we also have to control for those of us already on the planet, what is the footprint we're going to have.
Great. Questions?
happy to
Cattle
take.
was supposed to be one of the
Sorry?
emitters of methane.
Which?
Cattle.
Cattle, yes.
So that's
So,
something that
correct. A great question, because globally, about 20% of emissions is coming from the agricultural sector. Now, we know how India approaches WTO negotiations on agriculture. Don't touch it.
holy cow.
Right? Holy cow. Don't touch it. Right? Smallholder farmers, millions of smallholder farmers, political economy, too complicated. Don't touch it. Also, EU, you spend more per cow in subsidies than you give in aid to the rest of the world. Okay. So, that's one issue. Now, take the same negotiation and put it in the climate space. I would argue, and in fact, next month, we will be bringing out our next report on our 2050 emissions pathways. When we look, our bulk of our effort right now is in the power sector. Next effort, the biggest wedge is going to come from the industrial sector. Then comes transport. Agriculture, the potential for mitigation is actually, in terms of the wedges, is not as much. But globally, yes, very much. Meat consumption. When we say meat consumption, we are thinking of eating chicken. Okay. When they say meat consumption, they are talking about cattle, right? Now, obviously, the water and the energy footprint of cows is very different from the water and energy footprint for chicken. Also, when we say meat consumption, we are not, even the non-vegetarians amongst us, including, we are not having meat every day. When they talk about meat consumption, they are having meat every meal, right? So, it's lifestyle choices, demography, as well as the efficiency of your agricultural production. That said, you quoted Mr. Mahindra from the Davos meeting last month. We released an issue brief of ours. Mr. Chandrababu Naidu released an issue brief on what is called zero budget natural farming. Now, this is something that has been attempted in Andhra Pradesh already for 138,000 farmers. What is zero budget natural farming? To reduce, the zero budget part is to reduce farmer input costs from what an average farmer is spending to about 10% of that level. The natural farming part is replacing the fertilizer and the pesticide with natural concoctions, soil mulching, soil aeration. Right? So what we are now trying to test out is farm by farm, based on baselines. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence of increasing emissions, increasing productivity, yield, as well as incomes. But can this be scientifically established? The plan for the state is to do this for all 6 million farmers. So agriculture, without it becoming a climate negotiation issue, still does not stop us from looking at farmer resilience, farmer productivity, farmer increasing income, as well as sustainability.
I'm very glad that we had the opportunity to hear you at this Sustainability Council meeting, because I think it motivates all of us to think about these issues and try to do whatever we can to address them.
Thank you very much.